Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I'm doing fine today. I know we missed a couple weeks, and I want to thank everybody for being patient. I've had some family things going on, and I might have to miss again at some point. Family members very ill, but I thank you all, and I have missed you guys and telling you stories, and I think I have some pretty good stories today.
All right, so let me get the commercials out of the way very quickly then. We have the Facebook groups. We have our email address. Both of those links are or links for everything will be in the description. Uh, Please consider subscribing if you're on one of the video platforms, if you aren't already subscribed. If you are, thank you very much. Um, And we'd like to say, thanks for the new people coming on board. I mean,
Yes,
that's it's nice to know that our efforts don't go unnoticed. I want to sound very, very grateful to everyone who does it. I think if we even had one subscriber, we'd still do this because it's
yes.
it's one of those things that, it's just it's I don't know about you, but I feel a need to do it.
Yeah, it's a labor of
So,
love. You do it
mhm.
because you enjoy it. That's
Right,
how I
right,
feel.
right. So, okay, that's it for the commercial break. And so, what is our topic for today?
Well, this is going to be the first half of a two-parter. And it is what hides in the water.
Excellent. Oh, speaking of two-parter, we did get a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but I mean, comparatively to what we get, quite a few comments about the Monsters in the Basement episode. So
Really?
the out of the comments that we got, the consensus was they want more, and I
Ooh.
wouldn't mind hearing more either. So, but anyway, didn't mean to steal your thunder there, but I just remembered that. So, um, please.
Well, no, we'll start making sure we start working on another episode for the Monsters in the Basement. But in right now, we're going to talk about what hides in the water. Now, I'm going to break this down into two pieces. And the first piece is going to be historical, and it's going to be maybe a little more of some of the things you might have heard. But there's also going to be a lot of stories that I didn't know until I started doing the research. And then when we get to the 20th century, oh my goodness, do I have stories to tell? But here we go. So, of course, the first thing that you would think of about what is under the water are mermaids. We should recognize that almost 97% of the planet is covered with water. Now, that's not land mass versus that is ice, that is rivers and creeks and streams, that is all of it, not just oceans. And believe it or not, I have found freshwater mermaids as well as the more saltwater variety. But I've also found a lot of other things as well. So here we are. So obviously, mermaids are often considered these beautiful young women. They have the top half of a woman and the bottom half of a fish. Interestingly enough, going through almost every culture around the world, anywhere they touch on water, even if it's just like rivers, there are stories of mermaids of some sort. And they may not call them a mermaid, but definitely falls into that category. Now, I have to tell you, the modern answer for everything is a manatee. Every time you come up with a story like this, they'll say things like, oh, so and so saw a manatee. Okay, we're talking a 10 to 12 foot, really large creature that moves very, very slowly in the water. And honestly, when you hear the descriptions of some of these creatures this week and next, you're going to go, that is absolutely ridiculous. We're not talking about that creature at all. We're talking about beautiful, sleek creatures that move rapidly, keeping pace with ships and other, things that are going on. It's just fascinating. So here we are. Now, in history of mermaids are often depicted as sort of like a siren. A siren is, however, is a woman head with a bird body. So they're different, and they're usually more evil, trying to deliberately kill men. Mermaids have a mixed history. So some of them seem to be very kind-hearted and would save sailors. Others would lure them to their grave. And most people today only ever think about mermaids in the fashion of like the Disney mermaids, Ariel, who longed to be a woman. And interestingly enough, we're going to come across something fairly similar to that at some point here. However, I want to start with some of the really interesting historical stories. So Christopher Columbus, on January the 9th of 1493, he was in the Dominican Republic, and in his ship's journal, he wrote that he had seen 3 mermaids the day before. And he wrote that they are not half as beautiful as they are painted. And 6 months earlier, that would be, so we were talking halfway through 1492, he was sailing off with his 3 ships, and he took a route headed for Asia. Instead, he got lost and ended up in the New World. But he encountered these beings, and he said that they were mermaids, that they were large and ugly, not nearly as pretty as he thought. Now, again, I'm going to come back to, so today we talk about something called the manatee, or something called a stellar sea cow, which is, by the way, extinct. And it became extinct in approximately 1760. I don't know how they know the exact day, but they're like science and history likes to tell you its exact date. But I'm pretty sure nobody like wrote it down and said, "Oh, this is the last of those to die." But when you're looking at the stories of these mythical creatures, you don't come up with a 1,200-pound being. In fact, many of these are described as completely petite and very beautiful. So again, he discovers this, and he says that he actually saw 3 of them doing tail stands, their heads lifting, and their torsos are out of the water. Their forelimbs looked almost like arms. He said almost, not as though they were arms, and they were able to turn their heads from side to side. It was dusk, and after having been at sea for 6 months, and we were much intrigued by these creatures. Now, the gentleman who reports this for this particular article, he says, and I quote, "For having been at sea for 6 months and possibly having had too much rum, it is understandable that this poor experienced sailor might have seen a sea cow and thought it was a mermaid." But again, you can pretty much, 1,200-pound animal does not look like a girl any way you want to look at it. So, but that's one of them. But there are many, many stories. They go all the way back into history. But we're going to go do one called, this is on the Hebrides Island off of Scotland. There were crofters. They were basically kind of farmers, if you will, but they were harvesting seaweed on the shore when they spotted the figure of a small woman in the water. Some of the men tried to catch her, and she escaped. A boy threw a rock, and they heard her cry out in pain, and she went under the water. A few days later, her body was found washed ashore. The crowds were gathered. They were, they couldn't believe what had happened. Now, the chief of the MacDonald clan, which was one of the largest Scottish clans, he was also the local sheriff, and he had the mermaid brought in to the church. And he describes her as having the upper half of, that was the size of a 4-year-old girl with larger bosoms than you would expect. Her skin was soft and white, and she had long dark hair. The lower half was like a salmon without the scales, so a pink salmon. He ordered that a coffin be made for this young woman, or young mermaid, and that she be buried in the churchyard. Her funeral was held, and in the church books, the notes of the church, it actually documents that they had a funeral for her. And I thought that was really fascinating. In 1833, a professor of natural history of Edinburgh University spotted Scottish fishermen who had captured a live mermaid and held it captive for 3 hours while they studied it. The creature apparently had the face of a monkey, the torso of a woman, and a tail like a dogfish. That's how he describes it. Now, interestingly enough, you're going to come across this monkey idea again. There's multiple accounts of a monkey-faced mermaid with
First I've heard of that. Yeah.
oh, I'm telling you, I found them in multiple countries, but really a lot of them in Japan, which we're going to get to here shortly. So in Japan, this one is called the Shaman of Hakata. Now in Japan, there's a long association with mermaids. They're an island, so of course, stories of seafaring, creatures and stuff like that would be very prevalent. They describe their version as unlike the buxom European one. They usually describe them as either monkey-faced or fish-faced with a human torso with sharp teeth, and occasionally they are said to have horns, and they are said to have magic powers, though they're not always specified, although we are going to come into some stories about that in a minute. The remains of a Japanese mermaid were seen in Fukata in the temple, and are in a temple in that area. In 1222, a mermaid was said to have washed ashore at the Hakata Bay. The local shaman declared the mermaid was a good omen, and decided that she had to be buried at the temple there. The temple actually is now, it's called, I'm not going to even try to say the word because I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get it right, but it means the undersea palace of the dragon god, which is fitting. So for many years, people would come to this temple and they would drink water, which is said to have been had the mermaid's bones soaking in it. I know it sounds weird to you. I get it.
Mhm.
However, that's because it had the ability to help them fight epidemics. They believed it gave them some form of immunity to certain epidemics that were going around at different points. Now, 6 of the bones are said to still be in the temple, and they have been, kind of rubbed smooth by the water. And the guardians of the temple were approached about a DNA on the bones. They decided after a while to not have a DNA test because they thought it was sacrilegious to let them cut pieces of the bone and what have you. But scientists have studied the bones, and they cannot tell you what animal it came from, which I thought was really interesting. So I thought that was fascinating to me that they came up with well, we're not quite sure. Now, Henry Hudson, the great explorer of the 17th century, is known for exploring North America and looking for the strait where he could get passage through. He made 4 expeditions to the Northwest Passage, looking for the Northwest Passage from the Far East. When he went through the Arctic, was blocked by ice on his second voyage, and he changed his course and sailed northeast toward the Russian region of Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic Ocean. And during this change, he said he came into a water where the waters there that were extremely cold, but he saw in his accounts, he said he saw a mermaid. He described a mermaid as being from the navel up, the size of a grown woman with white skin and long black hair. Going down, he saw a tail the shape of a porpoise with a speckled mackerel pattern, or perhaps more like a porpoise. But he definitely describes it in his notes for his ship log. And I thought that was, that's interesting because you never hear stories like that about explorers early on. There's very few of those, except for sea captains and what have you. But he was, even when he goes inland, he finds there's some interesting other stories we'll talk about in different episodes coming up. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of Prince Shokoto, who was a historical figure in Japan's history. Now, I want you to understand, this guy came from the 7th century. He was a scholar. He was a military leader, and he literally penned the 17-article Constitution, which set up the ethical behavior for military officers. So he was a very serious man. However, check this story out. He wrote that when he was at Lake Biwa, he saw a merman. He said the merman was dying, and so he began to tell a strange tale. He spoke in Japanese, And he said that he had once been a fisherman who had sailed into forbidden waters. As a punishment, he turned into a hideous fish creature. The merman clearly felt that he had a just punishment because he asked the prince to build a temple to display his body after death and to warn other fishermen to stay outside the lines. Now, reading through this, there were places on the maps where sailors were told not to sail. These were enchanted waters, or they were off limits for some magical or mystical reason. Apparently, that's what happened here is he went into an area he knew he shouldn't have gone into, and he claimed he was changed by these beings into a fish kind of man. It's interesting that this man, who obviously everybody had a lot of respect for, would risk his reputation to write this story, but he did. Now, if you want to go to see the temple, it is on Mount Fuji, and you can actually go there today. It is said that the mummified remains of the merman are watched over by the Buddhist monks who attend the temple.
That begs the question, so who's policing the enchanted areas and performing such transmogrifications?
It is interesting. And there's just like, I can't wait to get to next week's episode because wait till you see where we're headed. So there's this gentleman by the name of Richard Whitbourne. He was a sea captain, and he was he lived in the 17th centuries. He was an adventurer. There's about the best way you can put it, and a businessman. And he fought battles against the Spanish Armada. He organized supply lines for fish from Newfoundland to the Mediterranean. He had a lot of experience in business acumen, and he, isn't the guy you would have expected to be telling stories like this. However, he tells of a story off the coast of Newfoundland where he encountered a mermaid that was swimming cheerfully. I'm going to read it how he wrote it. Swimming cheerfully toward the small boats he and his crew were sailing offshore. He said he stated that the mermaid swam swiftly, diving under the water at times and then rising out of the water high enough for him to behold her bare shoulders and back. He made a point of claiming that he did not look at her front torso, just in case anybody thought he was immodest. In his note, that is actually there. So he claims that she came up to the boat and she tried to pull herself in. But one of the sailors was afraid, and he struck at her with an oar. It hit her, and she let go of the boat. She went toward another one of the small boats to pull herself in, and the men there were frightened, and they all began to row frantically towards shore. And he said that, he was kind of disappointed that the men had reacted the way they had. He would like to have had a close-up inspection. Now, interestingly enough, this was literally written in his journals, in his neat script. It's tucked in there amongst other things, so we know that he wrote about it at that time. Just as a matter of course, it's not something that was, later added. Now, John Smith, everybody remembers Captain John Smith from the Pocahontas story, He had a possible encounter, and I'm going to say possible for this reason. There is a story that in the journals he wrote about seeing what he claimed to be a green-haired woman in 1614. And he said it was a green-haired woman, by no means unattractive, swimming in the water. When she turned to dive, I was shocked to see her mermaid's tail. So when she dove down in, he could see the bottom half of her at that point. Now, of course, the standard argument is he saw a manatee with apparently green hair and a mermaid's tail. However, there are some people who question this story, and of all the stories I'm telling today, this is probably one of the ones I'm more unsure of, because that story does not appear in his handwriting. It doesn't appear until Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, The Man in the Iron Mask, those things, wrote about it, and he said he quoted from the journals, but nowhere in the journals can anybody find this. So there is a little bit of a askiance on this particular topic, but still very interesting. Now, Blackbeard, Edward Titch, I find him fascinating. I always have. So for the people who think of him and they just immediately think pirate, he wasn't really a pirate. He was a privateer. And a privateer, just so people know, was a person who got a letter commissioning them to be basically pirates, but for the British Crown. And you could go out and whatever plunder you had, as long as it was from their enemy, which at that point in time would have been the French, you could keep the plunder and the ship, because what you were doing was weakening the French. And that's exactly what the British government wanted you to do. But whenever all of this, and this was during the Queen Anne War, and whenever the Queen Anne's War ended, then Edward Teach continued doing what he'd been doing so lucratively prior, and now all of a sudden he is a criminal. And his history is fascinating. It really is. He had 300 men on his crew, not on one ship. He had multiple ships. And his ship, the ship he always sailed, the lead ship, was called the Queen Anne's Revenge. And in 1718, he would deliberately run her aground to get rid of some of the sailors on board that particular vessel. He thought they were about to mutiny, and so he would rather scuttle his ship than lose it to them, and that's exactly what he did. However, in the books of his logs, which still exist, believe it or not, he ordered his crew on multiple occasions to stay away from what he termed the enchanted waters, because they are populated with merfolks. And he stated in different entries that he had seen merfolk with his own eyes, and that he was afraid to vex them because he had seen them harm others. So one of the things that he continually talked about with his crew is there are certain places you couldn't go, and he insisted he had seen these merfolk for himself. So I thought that was interesting. Now this one I think you're going to find particularly interesting. This one is about a gentleman by the name of Henry Laux. Henry Laux was a fisherman who worked on the Susquehanna River here in Pennsylvania, where we both live, probably about 2.5, 3 hours drive from where we live. Now, interesting enough, in 1881, Laux reported 5 separate sightings of a mermaid on the Susquehanna River. He claimed the mermaid came out at sunrise and again at dusk, rising to the surface of the water, whereupon it looked around, floated on top of the water for a while, and then slowly sank beneath the surface, leaving its hair floating on the surface for a moment before disappearing into the depths of the river. Laux also said that he had considered shooting at it, but that he was worried about being charged with murder, as the top half of it looked very human. And so he forbore not to do this, but he actually went to the police about it, and he said, he was completely convinced that this thing had been living in a cave down under the Susquehanna River. So interestingly enough, at approximately the same time, newspapers in the area began to have stories about a mermaid in that area, and they finally, the local people published a letter in the newspaper stating that they would make sure that anyone who killed this being would be immune from prosecution as long as you could bring it in dead. And there were many who hunted for her, but she mysteriously disappeared. Over the course of time, there have been several really interesting bounties offered for mermaids. So now we're going to come to another story, which I think is really interesting. Bear with me just a second. Okay. So as I said, the physical description of the Japanese mermaids were very different from what we saw in the United States. Now, there is another story about a lighthouse, if you will, in that area, in Japan area, and they believed at this particular place, it's called Hokkaido, that the mermaids could turn themselves into jellyfish. These mermaids were thought to masquerade as beautiful kimono-clad women who would go onto the shore and seduce or lure men into the sea. Now, one of the things I found really interesting is that there are multiple stories of these beings being able to, for short periods of time, turn themselves into what look like women. So get rid of their fishtails and have legs and walk on the land. And there are multiple stories of this throughout the centuries. And in this story in particular, in 1870, the local people were saying that these mermaids were able to do that, and that they would lure people into the water. And when the men stepped into the water, they would turn themselves into giant jellyfish and kill the person foolish enough to have gone in and swam with them.
Hmm.
I thought that was really interesting. And one of the things that also found interesting is that there's no clear answers as to whether or not mermaids are deadly or not. Some of them seem to be very kind, and some of them seem to want to talk to humans, or at least interact with humans, whereas others seem bound on killing, and in some occasions even eating them, the humans.
Yuck.
I know.
Mhm, mhm.
So here's another story from Japan from 1610. A British sea captain supposedly saw a mermaid on from the pier at the port of Santo Johozo. Now, he's standing on the pier, kind of looking out at the water, and he said he saw a creature swimming in the water, rising up and down, moving very rapidly, and he was, standing there just kind of amazed. He said the being had the head of a woman atop a body of a fish, with prominent dorsal fins running down the middle of the upper body. And as he watched, she came up multiple times, leapt into the air, and went back under the water, very much like a dolphin would do. So you're also going to come across something called the Nijo, which are often sighted all around the waters around Japan. These are mermaids that could speak in English or in Japanese, whatever, that they could speak, and they could talk to these men, and if they would get captured, they would start trying to barter or bargain with the sailors who captured them, and beg them to let them loose, and I'll give you a treasure or stuff like that. And they would continue doing so until they were able to break free or escape if possible. I thought that was interesting, and I'm going to tell a story next week that is really fascinating, because it's just an insanely interesting story about something that's happening right now when it comes to mermaids.
Yeah.
So around the mid 1800s, early 1800s, there in Japan in particular, there were a lot of mermaids caught, and they would be brought back from Japan with sailors or captains and what have you. One person who took a particular interest in them was P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, of course, was famous for his Fiji mermaid. And he had a specimen. He had one he would put on display. And he said it was a Japanese mermaid, is how he portrayed it. Now, everybody believes that this Japanese mermaid was made up. There are many stories of taxidermists who would make mythical creatures, particularly mermaids, because they were lucrative. You could sell them. So people would come and buy them for the curiosity's sake. And it was always commonly believed that the Fiji mermaid was one of those. However, there's a lot of mystery around the Fiji mermaid. It was believed that P.T. Barnum lost the mermaid whenever there was a fire at one of his complexes in 1860s, and that is kind of where it stood for a long, long time. However, recently, a person found a mermaid in the Stanton White collection. Now, people may not know who Stanton White was, but Stanton White was a hugely famous architect of the early 20th century. And he built many of the luxurious and amazing structures in the older sections of New York City. He was also became world known, I shouldn't say renowned, world known for becoming part of a lover's triangle that ended in a murder and all kinds of craziness. But he was this very, very famous architect. And he bought P.T. Barnum's relics when his estate was sold. And among the relics that have recently been rediscovered is what might very well be the Fiji mermaid.
Hmm.
So there may be a chance for people to see it again. There may be a chance for scientists to look into it. And I just find it very interesting. So it was actually found in 1996 at St. Bonaventure University in Western New York, which is where Stanton White's collection was donated upon his death. And it sat there and just sort of languished in the back, nobody paying any attention until it caught somebody's attention, and they began to do a history on where it came from and what it was. And they began to realize that it was most likely the Fiji mermaid. And it is known that he did buy P.T. Barnum's estate, which would have included anything like that. And there's never been any proof that the thing burnt. It was just that it stopped being exhibited. So heaven only knows. But I thought it was fascinating that we've come to that point. There is an old encyclopedia of Japanese American or Japanese animal life. And there was a gentleman who's much as there were early botanists and people who drew the animals, the birds, the trees and all the stuff that as they were coming into the United States for the first time, and they were exploring, and you find these amazing collections of their artwork as they were documenting what they saw. This also happened in Japan, and this particular gentleman, Kisu Ito, who was a scientist of his day, brought and who was believed to have helped bring Western medicine to Japan. He had an occupation of doing realistic sketches of marine life and what have you that he had seen. Interestingly, among all of the realistic sketches that he did of animals and birds and what have you, particularly fishes and things like that, he also cataloged several mermaids, and he did them as part of his collection as though they were just as common as you were such a sunfish or something, something like that. It's fascinating because he doesn't mark them in any way as different, and he literally just has them embedded in these collections as though, yep, that's another thing you find when you're in our area. I just thought it was really interesting that he would do that. If you drew something for just fun, you would just draw it for fun, but you wouldn't put it in the historical collection you want to document, everything in. So, as I said, this part was not going to be our longest part, but I am going to tell you that I will do one story coming into the 20th century, and that story will have to hold you over until we get to next week. And next week is going to be absolutely insane. There are just so many amazing stories. So, in 1943, during the World War II, there were some Japanese soldiers who were stationed on an island. And we're going to talk about what happened. This island's called the Key Islands, and they're located in Indonesia. They're a total area of about 550 square miles. They're beautiful with these pristine beaches. They're absolutely beautiful. And the soldiers were there because they were watching, they wanted to make sure that the Americans didn't get past them and what have you. So these Japanese soldiers were a surveillance team on this island, and that's all they had to do all day long was just sort of like keep an eye out, making sure that like American ships didn't come by, or noticing the movements of what was going on. And this is what makes this interesting. So they're on this island, this chain of islands, and one of them starts talking about having seen a strange creature in the water. And he describes it as having limbs and a face that is somewhat human, but with a mouth like a carp filled with needle-like teeth. The bizarre creature was about 150 centimeters. It had pink or salmon-colored skin and prominent spines or spikes on their heads, their necks, and their shoulders. Several other soldiers would very quickly come to have seen it as well. And unlike the classic mermaids, these entities did not have holy fish tails, but rather possessed two long arms and two prominent frog-like legs, both of which ended in talons. On multiple occasions, these beings were seen on the beach, cavorting around right at the mouth of the lagoons. In one case, two of these creatures were spotted playing in the lagoon, and another was reportedly seen swimming near the beach in a manner similar to a human being doing a breaststroke. One report was of a startled soldier who recalls seeing one of the creatures on the beach at night. He said that he thought it was a child standing on the beach and was kind of startled to see that there was that it was a child late in the middle of the night standing out there all by themselves. And as he made a sound to try to get the child's attention, and when it turned, he could see in the moonlight its facial features were not right. Like, it just looked disproportionate. So the creature caught sight of him and ran into the water, where it dove in and did not resurface. And he started to go after it, thinking it's going to drown if it was a kid,
Mhm.
And now he's a little startled. He doesn't know what to do. So he went for help. And when he came back, nobody could find anything. Now, these things they're seen multiple times by this group of soldiers over and over again. They seem to come out at dusk and early in the morning, and they play on the beach and run, and then they go back into the water, which seems to be their normal habitat. There are literally dozens upon dozens. One of them was a patrol of Japanese soldiers who claimed that they were going through a thicket of underbrush and they came upon a little lagoon. They thought it was kind of just, peaceful and beautiful. It looked completely abandoned. And then suddenly, as they're standing there looking out at this beautiful blue-white water, they saw what looked to be a large fish. And as they're watching it had a sun-speckled surface. And it began to thrash and pull itself out of the water onto an outcropping of rocks. They said it was pinkish in color and had ape-like features. Only it was devoid of hair and possessed an oversized mouth like a fish with arms that extended in webbed hands and claws. The creature turned, and the soldier saw his face very handily. It let out a gurgling, blurbing noise, and it didn't seem to be panicked at all. It was almost like it was trying to speak to him. After it made the noise a couple times, it got down into the water and walked through the water towards them, and used an almost human walk, but moved eloquently in a slow fashion. The speed with which it approached when it got closer suddenly startled them. The claws were up, and in that second, as it suddenly darted toward them, it made that burbling sound one more time, and the men began to fire. The water erupted as bullets kicked it up in all directions. And the rocks began to, ping apart where they were hitting them with the bullets. After that, the creature was gone, leaving the baffled troops none the wiser as to what had happened to it. It seemed impervious to their bullets.
Or they were all really, really bad shots.
Something. There is one
stormtrooper kind of.
I mean, like I said, they're fascinating. Like, that's the second time I brought up the monkey-faced one. There are literally dozens and dozens of accounts of monkey-faced merpeople, if you will. There's another story from those islands that talks about a soldier who was really tired, and he was it's hot, and he stops at the water's edge and kind of pouring water over his face, washing his face and his neck and kind of cooling off a little bit. When he looks up and he sees staring back at him a monkey-faced thing with a fish's mouth and spines like a sea urchin protruding from the surface 3 feet in front of him. And he said the thing had a fishy smell, very strong, almost overpowering. He stumbled backward, pulled his sidearm, and began to unload it. Again, he fired blindly, and nothing seemed to happen. Other soldiers, heard what was going on and came running. He was hysterical, telling them about the monkey-faced fish man that he had shot at. By now, the word's beginning to spread, amongst the soldiers that there's something going on. Other soldiers talked about seeing beasts in the water when they were going to the water to bathe. One soldier claimed to have seen one catching a fish and opening its mouth and stuffing the live fish into its mouth. They were frequently sighted in lagoons. Now, the local people knew exactly what they were talking about when they finally began to ask the locals what's going on. And they call them the orang ikan, which is in Malay means human fish. So it's a man fish. They are territorial, the locals told them, and you need to stay away from them and not go anywhere near them. Now, interestingly enough, there was a gentleman by the name of, was a sergeant, on one of the surveillance teams. His name was Taro Hariba, and he was summoned by the chief of the village, and he was told that a orangutan had been found dead on the beach and that he could look at the body. Now, you can see what we see all the time. It's here. You can check it out. He got to the village. He went in and he took a look, and he was absolutely shocked. He said he found himself wondering if what he was seeing could possibly be real. Nonetheless, the rational part of him assumed that it had to have some explanation. He described it as a dead creature that was laying out. It was approximately 160 centimeters long, possessing a head of red, brown, shoulder-length hair. Although it was very sparse and patchy, it had spines on its neck. Its face was ugly, with a combination of human ape-like features, a low, short nose, a short, broad forehead, and small ears. It had a lipless mouth, and that was wide, like that of a fish, and he said it reminded him of a carp and was filled with needle-sharp teeth. The creature's fingers and toes were long and webbed and ended in translucent claws. Hariba also reported that there was algae attached all over its body, which gave this a green cast in places. Upon returning to Japan, Hariba told of his experiences and urged zoologists to go and investigate the phenomena. He was insistent, but no one took him seriously, so nobody went to look. But this entire group of soldiers reported it multiple times. And that will end it for tonight. And if you think that story's good, wait till you see what else is coming up. So I thank everybody for their time and their patience, and I appreciate you being patient with me. And I'm looking forward to sharing the rest of these stories next week.
Yeah, me too. So thank you very much, Patty. And unless you have something else, good night.
Good night.